Welcome to Part 2 of Revelation in the End Times. I'm Norman Willis of NazareneIsrael.org. And in this video, we're going to talk about the 7 trumpets of Revelation and the 2 witnesses. You can find the written study on the Nazarene Israel website, www.NazareneIsrael.org. We expect the Great Tribulation to last approximately 7 years during the time of the trumpets. This chart shows how the trumpets are broken down into 2 parts, and the second part, the second 3.5 years of the 7-year period, is called the time of Jacob's trouble. Now notice, in the first 3.5 years, we just have generalized destruction, and we're going to go through all the details as we go. We're going to see what we call destruction by thirds. But in the second half of the Great Tribulation, the second 3.5 years, called the time of Jacob's trouble, the daily sacrifice is going to be taken away. The abomination of desolation will be set up. That will be the time, if you're in the land for whatever reason, unless you're one of the 2 witnesses, that will be the time to flee the land, because that's when the persecution begins in earnest. Those who do not take the mark of the beast are going to be killed. We'll talk more about the mark of the beast in later sections. Those who die during the time of Jacob's trouble are going to be part of the great multitude dressed in white. Again, this is also the time of the 2 witnesses ministry. But if you're not one of the 2 witnesses, it's time to flee the land. At the end of this 3.5 years, the 2 witnesses are going to die and are going to be resurrected. In Revelation chapter 8, starting in verse 2, it says, "And I saw the 7 angels who stand before Elohim, and to them were given 7 trumpets." Verse 3, "Then another angel or messenger, having a golden censer, came and stood at the altar. He was given much incense, that he should offer it with the prayers of all the saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne. And the smoke of the incense, with the prayers of the saints, ascended before Elohim from the messenger's hand." Skip to verse 5. "Then the messenger took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and threw it to the earth. And there were noises, thunderings, lightnings, and an earthquake." Again, we're going to see these earthquakes. These are social quakes. They're changes in the nature of society, which is going to take place at the time of the trumpets. Verse 6, "So the 7 messengers who had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound." Now notice, we're going to take a look. The tribulation will affect the whole world, but the tribulation is going to be much more intense in the land of Israel itself. Verse 7, "The first messenger sounded, and hail and fire followed, mingled with blood, and they were thrown to the earth. And 1/3 of all the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. Then the second messenger sounded, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea. And 1/3 of the sea became blood, and 1/3 of the living creatures in the sea died, and 1/3 of the ships were destroyed." Now, in Psalms chapter 46, in verse 2, we read, "Therefore we will not fear, even though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea." Then in verse 6 it says, "The nations raged, the kingdoms were moved. He uttered his voice, the earth melted." What we're going to see as we go along is that Scripture equates spiritual mountains with the kingdoms of the earth. Returning to Revelation chapter 8 in verse 10. It says, "Then the 3rd messenger sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch. And it fell on 1/3 of the rivers and on the springs of water." There's our destruction by thirds again. "The name of the star is wormwood. 1/3 of the waters became wormwood, and many men died from the water, because it was made bitter." Now we need to understand the star is symbolic of a spirit. Wormwood is an extremely bitter plant. Water is also symbolic of the spirit, but it can represent doctrines. Now let's notice, just draw some parallels here. Yeshua was sacrificed on a tree. In Exodus, a tree is thrown into bitter waters to make them sweet. I just want you to see the symbolism here. In Exodus chapter 15, starting in verse 22, we read, "So Moshe, or Moses, brought Israel from the Red Sea. Then they went out into the wilderness of Shur. And they went 3 days into the wilderness, and found no water. Now when they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore the name of it was called Marah. And the people complained against Moshe, saying, "What shall we drink?" So he cried out to Yahweh, and Yahweh showed him a tree. Then he cast it into the waters, and the waters were made sweet. So if we take the symbolism here and try to understand it at the meta level, perhaps Yeshua's sacrifice on a tree took a bitter situation and made the waters, or in other words the Spirit, sweet. So if we think about this, the reverse should also be true. Turning away from Yeshua's sacrifice would make the waters bitter again. Now, a one-world religion would cause us to turn away from the truth of Yeshua and towards the truth of man. This would make the waters of doctrine, or of the Spirit, bitter. Now we have to notice salt is also symbolic of the Torah, or the laws of Moses. Salt also can make waters better, as long as we're talking about symbolism. In Matthew chapter 5 and verse 13, Yeshua himself tells us, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It's then good for nothing, but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men." In 2 Kings chapter 2, starting in verse 19, we take a look and we see it says, "Then the men of the city said to Elisha," please notice, the situation of this city is pleasant, as my master sees, but the water is bad, or the Spirit is bad, and the ground is barren. And he said, "Bring me a new bowl and put salt in it." So they brought it to him. Then he went out to the source of the water and cast the salt in there, and said, "Thus says Yahweh, I have healed this water. From it there shall be no more death or barrenness." So the water remains healed to this day, according to the word of Elisha, which he spoke. Now, some liken the Torah, or the laws of Moses, to salt. So the waters, or the spirit of a place, or the doctrine, can be made good by adding salt, adding the Torah. Returning back to Revelation chapter 8, starting in verse 12, we read, "And then the fourth messenger sounded, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that 1/3 of them were darkened. 1/3 of the day did not shine, and likewise the night." Now we need to remember, Revelation is a highly symbolic vision. We're going to see later that water is not even symbolic of water. But we take a look at the symbolism here. The sun, we've already seen, is symbolic of Yeshua and his Spirit. The moon can be symbolic of the Torah, or the laws of Moses. You can't see as well to walk by the light of the law as you can by the light of Yeshua's Spirit, but nonetheless you can walk. Now the stars, we're told elsewhere, are a reference to Abraham's seed. This refers to both the Christians, the Jews, and also the Islamic, or the Muslim people. The hypothesis is this speaks to a time when 1/3 of Abraham's descendants either fall away or are killed. Now, let's bear in mind, the first 4 trumpets were very bad, but yet they didn't qualify as woes. Trumpets 5, 6, and 7 are much worse, and they do qualify as woes. So what we see here is that Yahweh is slowly stepping up his punishments upon mankind in order to get his people to turn back to him. When you have a child, first you start by talking to the child. If the child doesn't respond, then you time the child out. If he still doesn't respond, you might give him a spanking. If he still doesn't respond, then you're on the way to the woodshed. So Yahweh has tried to turn the children back during the first 4 trumpets, and it hasn't worked. So now we're getting ready for the woes. In Revelation chapter 9, starting in verse 1, it says, "Then the 5th messenger sounded, and I saw a star fallen from heaven to the earth, and to him was given the key to the bottomless pit. Now we know that the star has to be symbolic of a demon, and the bottomless pit also has to be symbolic, because no literal star can be given a key to a bottomless pit. Verse 2. And he opened the bottomless pit, and smoke arose out of the pit, like the smoke of a great furnace. So the sun and the air were darkened, because of the smoke of the pit. Then out of the smoke locusts came upon the earth, and to them was given power, as the scorpions of the earth have power. And they were commanded not to harm the grass of the earth, or any green thing, or any tree, but only those men who do not have the seal of Elohim on their foreheads. This is referring to the 144,000. And they were not given authority to kill them, but to torment them for 5 months. Their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it strikes a man. Verse 6. In those days men will seek death, but will not find it. They will desire to die, but death will flee from them. The shape of the locusts was like horses prepared for battle. On their heads were crowns of something like gold, and their faces were like the faces of men. Obviously, these are not literal locusts. We don't truly know what they symbolize. Verse 8. They had hair like women's hair, and their teeth were like lions' teeth. And they had breastplates like breastplates of iron. Later we're going to see that iron is symbolic of Rome. And the sound of their wings was like the sound of chariots, with many horses running into battle. They had tails like scorpions, and their stings were in their tails. Their power was to hurt men for 5 months. And they had as king over them the messenger of the bottomless pit, whose name in Hebrew was Abaddon, which means destroyer. But in Greek he has the name Apollyon, which has the same meaning. One woe is past. Behold, still 2 more woes are coming after these things. Now, some teachers are saying this passage was fulfilled by the Islamic Saracens in the Middle Ages, but we know this interpretation can't work because this is still a future event. We haven't seen Seal 6 yet, so at the time of this filming, this is still to take place. Verse 13. Then the 6th messenger sounded, and I heard a voice from the 4 horns of the golden altar which is before Elohim, saying to the 6th messenger who had the trumpet, Release the 4 messengers who are bound at the great river Euphrates. So the 4 messengers who had been prepared for the hour and the day and the month and the year were released to kill 1/3 of mankind. Now the number of the army of the horsemen was 200 million. I heard the number of them. We know that the Chinese army is literally 200 million men, with all their reservists called up. Others have suggested this may be a reference to the Muslim or the Islamic soldiers in the Middle East. It might also refer at the spiritual level to 200 million demons. All of these are possible. But an interesting thing about this passage is that it shows us that while there will be a one world order, not everyone will belong to it, or else there would not be fighting between the nations. Revelation 9 and verse 17. And thus I saw the horses in the vision. Those who sat on them had breastplates of fiery red, hyacinth blue, and sulfur yellow. And the heads of the horses were like the heads of lions, and out of their mouths came fire, smoke, and brimstone. By these 3 plagues 1/3 of mankind was killed, by the fire and the smoke and the brimstone which came out of their mouths. For their power is in their mouths and in their tails. For their tails are like serpents, having heads, and with them they do harm. But the rest of mankind, who were not killed by these plagues, did not repent of the works of their hands, that they should not worship demons and idols of gold, silver, brass, stone, and wood, which can neither see, nor hear, nor walk. Verse 21. And they did not repent of their murders, or their sorceries, or their sexual immorality, or their thefts. Now let's refer to the chart again. I'd like you to see that this is the time frame The first 3.5 years is destruction by thirds. The second 3.5 is Jacob's trouble. During this time of Jacob's trouble is probably when we see the 7 thunders coming up. Revelation chapter 10 and verse 1. I saw still another mighty messenger coming down from heaven, clothed with a cloud. And a rainbow was on his head. His face was like the sun, and his feet like pillars of fire. Many believe this is Yeshua, whose face is described like the sun, and his feet are described elsewhere in Revelation like pillars. Verse 2. He had a little book open in his hand, and he set his right foot on the sea, and his left foot on the land. And he cried out with a loud voice, as when a lion roars. When he cried out, 7 thunders uttered their voices. Now when the 7 thunders uttered their voices, I was about to write, but I heard a voice from heaven saying to me, Seal up the things which the 7 thunders uttered, and do not write them. So the 7 thunders are sealed up, so we don't even know what they are. Our only clue is that they seem to take place during the time of Jacob's trouble, so we know that's got to be bad. Verse 5. The messenger whom I saw standing on the sea and on the land raised up his hand to heaven, and swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created heaven and the things that are in it, the earth and the things that are in it, and the sea and the things that are in it, that there should be delay no longer. But in the days of the sounding of the 7th messenger, when he is about to sound, the mystery of Elohim would be finished, as he declared to his servants the prophets. And what this tells us is it's no longer going to be a mystery after trumpet 7. Then the voice which I heard from heaven spoke to me again, saying, Go, take the little book which is open in the hand of the messenger, who stands on the sea and on the earth. So I went to the messenger and said to him, Give me the little book. And he said to me, Take and eat it. It will make your stomach bitter, but it will be sweet as honey in your mouth. Then I took the little book out of the messenger's hand and ate it, and it was as sweet as honey in my mouth. But when I had eaten it, my stomach became bitter. And he said to me, You must again prophesy about many peoples, nations, tongues, and kings. Revelation 11, starting in verse 1. Then I was given a reed like a measuring rod, and the messenger stood, saying, Rise, and measure the temple of Elohim, the altar, and those who worship there. So now because he's given a measuring rod, and he's told to measure the temple of Elohim, we believe this is a physical temple, elsewise he wouldn't be told to measure it. Verse 2, he says, But leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the set-apart city underfoot for 42 months, or 3.5 years. Now I'd like to take just a moment, and we're going to talk about why we believe the tribulation is 7 years. We are also going to talk about why we believe the time of Jacob's trouble is the last 3.5 years of the tribulation. In Daniel chapter 9 and verse 25, we're told, Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, which is a reference to Yeshua, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublesome times. Now, Yeshua fulfills this verse perfectly. The wall was being rebuilt in troublesome times. That's a reference to the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. So we have no issues so far. Returning to Daniel 9 and verse 26, it says, And after the 62 weeks, Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. Again, a reference to Yeshua. And the people of the prince who is to come, we believe that's a reference to the Roman general Titus, shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end of it shall be with a flood. Until the end of the war, desolations are determined. Now, this phrase here, the end of it shall be with a flood. Until the end of the war, desolations are determined. We believe this is a future fulfillment, as there was no flood ending Yeshua's ministry. This seems to speak instead of the fall of Rome and or Babylon, the flood being the outpouring of the Spirit. We'll talk more about this in later sections. We're turning to Daniel 9 in verse 27. It says, "Then he," we believe is a reference to the anti-Messiah, "shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week." Now actually in Hebrew the word is shavua, which means a 7. So he's saying shall confirm a covenant with many for 1/7. Could be 7 years. But in the middle of the 7, meaning at the 3.5-year mark, he, meaning the anti-Messiah, shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. Some believe that Yeshua fulfilled this prophecy back in the 1st century, but it's not clear how Yeshua confirmed a covenant with many for only just 1 week. It doesn't fit. What fits closer is the idea that the papacy will put an end to sacrifice and offering 3.5 years into the trumpets, or halfway point at the tribulation. This is when the time of Jacob's trouble begins. Daniel 9 in verse 27, again, part B. "And on the wing of abominations," which is a reference to the temple, "shall be one who makes desolate," which could be a reference to the Islamic Mahdi, or the Islamic Messiah, "even until the consummation, which is determined, is poured out on the desolate." And as we'll see, the consummation is a reference to the wedding feast, and it refers to the outpouring of the cups of wrath. We'll talk more about that later. Now if we jump to Daniel chapter 12, starting in verse 11, take a look at another passage. It says, "And from the time the daily sacrifice is taken away, and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days of tribulation. Blessed is he who waits and comes to the 1,335 days, which is 45 more days than the 1,290 or the 3.5 years. So let's take a look at a hypothesis. The last half of the 7-year tribulation is 3.5 years. 3.5 years is 1,260 days. As we'll see in the chart, the cups probably last an additional 30 days. The wedding feast might then be another 45 days for a total of 1,335 days, which would be why he who is blessed who waits and comes to the 1,335 days. Returning back to Revelation 11 and verse 2, we read, "But leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the set-apart city underfoot for 42 months, or 3.5 years. This could be a reference to the time of Jacob's trouble. So during the time of Jacob's trouble, that's also when we see the 2 witnesses' ministry, which is why Revelation 11 and verse 3 says, "And I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth." These are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands standing before the Elohim of the whole earth. And if anyone wants to harm them, fire proceeds from their mouth and devours their enemies. If anyone wants to harm them, he must be killed in this manner. These have the power to shut heaven so that no rain falls in the days of their prophecy, and they have power over water to turn them to blood, and to strike the earth with all plagues as often as they desire. When they finish their testimony, the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit, which is a reference to Satan, will make war against them, overcome them, and kill them. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where our Master also was crucified, being a reference to Jerusalem. Then those from the people, tribes, tongues, and nations will see their dead bodies 3.5 days, but not allow their dead bodies to be put into graves. This is probably a reference to 3.5 literal days. We know the 2 witnesses are killed at the end of the tribulation. Now, there's not 1,260 days from the end of the tribulation to the wedding feast. There's only perhaps an additional 75 days. So it couldn't be 3.5 years. It has to be 3.5 literal days, because we have 30 more days to the cups and 45 more days until the wedding feast, or Armageddon. Revelation 11 and verse 10. And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them, make merry, and send gifts to one another, because these two prophets tormented those who dwell on the earth. Think of the sickness. They're partying over the death of Yahweh's two witnesses. Now after the 3.5 days, the breath of life from Elohim entered them, and they stood on their feet, and great fear fell on those who saw them. And they heard a loud voice from heaven, saying to them, Come up here. And they ascended to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies saw them. In the same hour there was a great earthquake, and 1/10 of the city fell. And in the earthquake 7,000 people were killed, and the rest were afraid, and gave glory to the Elohim of heaven. The second woe is past. Behold, the third woe is coming quickly. Some have suggested that the two witnesses are the two houses, and this might make some sense, except that when the two witnesses are called up to heaven, if that's the two houses of Israel, both Judah and Ephraim, then that would be the end of the story. But we know there's a lot more to the story that yet has to take place. So it makes more sense that these are two individuals. Now let's take a look at some similarities with Luke chapter 21. Luke chapter 21 and verse 20 says, But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those who are in the midst of her depart, and let not those who are in the country enter her. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe to those who are pregnant, and to those who are nursing babies in those days. For there will be great distress in the land, and wrath upon this people. This is probably a reference to the second half of the tribulation period, the time of Jacob's trouble. Once the abomination of desolation goes up, it's a good time to run. It's a good time to flee the land, unless you're one of the two witnesses, unless you're really called to be there by his Spirit. Luke 21 and verse 24, it says, And they will fall by the edge of the sword, and be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Again, we believe this is the second half of the tribulation, the time of Jacob's trouble. Let's compare Revelation 11 and verse 2 with Luke 21 and verse 24. We see the same thing, the set-apart city being tread underfoot until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Luke 21 and verse 25. And there will be signs in the sun, could be symbolic of Christianity, and in the moon, symbolic of Judaism, and in the stars, symbolic of Islam. And on the earth, distress of nations, again referring to national boundaries, with perplexity, meaning it's a mystery. The sea, which we'll see later is a reference to people, and the waves roaring. Men's hearts failing them from fear and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of heaven will be shaken. Once again, this is a reference to a spiritual earthquake. Verse 27, Then they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud, with power and great glory, which is a reference to Armageddon at the 1,335 days. Now when these things begin to happen, look up and lift your heads, because your redemption draweth nigh. Now there's some theories about who the two witnesses are. Some suggest that they're the two houses. We've already shown that can't be the case, because if they go to heaven, that's the end of the story. Others suggest that one of them is Moses or Moshe. The other one is that he's Elijah or Eliyahu. We talk about this more in the book. It makes more sense, rather than a literal physical resurrection of these two individuals, it might make more sense that we have two people we see come in the power and spirit of Moses and Elijah, or Moshe and Eliyahu, much like John the Baptist came in the power and spirit of Eliyahu or Elijah. What we're going to see in the next part, we're going to see trumpet number 7 is going to open up the cup judgments. So we've just had the tribulation. The tribulation is going to open the cup judgments. Yahweh's been trying to turn his people back all these 7 years. It hasn't worked. By the time they kill his two witnesses, That's over. It's enough. It's time for the punishments now. At trumpet number 7, it's also when Satan or Babylon's reign begins to crumble and fall, much like Nebuchadnezzar's statue crumbled and fell when it was struck by the stone, and we'll take a look at that. And it marks the beginning of the reign of Yahweh. So trumpet number 7 is our major time point. We'll know seal 6 when we see it, because we'll have a nuclear crisis in the Middle East. But we'll also know that trumpet number 7 is our major counting time point. Revelation chapter 11, starting in verse 15. And the 7th messenger sounded, and there were loud voices in heaven, saying, The kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of Yahweh and of his Messiah, and he shall reign forever and ever. So that means Satan's kingdom is falling and Yahweh's kingdom is being set up. And the 24 elders who sat before Elohim on their thrones fell on their faces and worshipped Elohim, saying, We give you thanks, O Yahweh Elohim Almighty, the one who is, and who was, and who is to come, because you have taken your great power and reigned. The nations were angry, and your wrath has come, and the time of the dead, that they should be judged, and that you should reward your servants, the prophets and the saints, and those who fear your name, small and great, and that you should destroy those who destroy the earth, at trumpet number 7. Then the temple of Elohim was opened in heaven, and the ark of his covenant was seen in his temple, and there were lightnings, noises, thunderings, an earthquake, another spiritual shake-up in the order of things, and great hail. So we're going to see another great earthquake as Babylon's kingdom begins to fall and Yahweh's kingdom is going to be set up. We're going to see a spiritual shake-up in the order of things. A lot of things are going to be changing. Very, very turbulent time during this whole period of time. But now, what is the kingdom? We have to understand this both at the spiritual and the physical level. The kingdom is both internal and external. The kingdom is both spiritual and the shadow picture material. In Mark chapter 1 and verse 14, we saw that the kingdom of Elohim was offered, or the kingdom of Elohim is at hand. It's literally being offered. Then in Luke 17 and verse 20, we're told, Behold, the kingdom is within you. It's a spiritual kingdom. But the kingdom, Yahweh's kingdom, is also a literal kingdom, as it was in the days of Kings David and Solomon. In Daniel chapter 2 and verse 44 we read, And in the days of these kings the Elohim of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. It's a reference to trumpet number 7. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Let's compare also to Daniel chapter 7 and verse 26. It says, But the court shall be seated, and they shall take away the little horn, or the Pope's dominion, to consume and destroy it forever. Then the kingdom and dominion, and the greatness of all the kingdoms under the whole heaven, shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High. Very important phrase. Remember this one. The greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him, beginning at trumpet number 7. So we have to remember that's who the kingdom is given to, is the people, the saints of the Most High. Notice we're told that this is the same as all dominions serving and obeying him. In Revelation chapter 2, starting in verse 26, we're told, And he who overcomes and keeps my works until the end, to him I will give power over the nations. He shall rule them with a rod of iron. They shall be dashed to pieces like the potter's vessels, as I have also received from my Father. Now we know this is a reference to Psalm 2, but notice that we're told that to him who overcomes will have power over the nations. And this is just the same as we're told in Daniel chapter 7, that the kingdom shall be given to the people, to the saints of the Most High. So all these verses match up. Now if we go to Matthew chapter 24 and verse 21, we're told, Yeshua is telling us, For then there will be great tribulation, such has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. and unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. Now, if we take a look at this, this tells us that the elect, possibly the 144,000, cannot be raptured out according to the classic pre-tribulational rapture paradigm, because the tribulation is shortened for their sake. If they're already raptured out in heaven, it doesn't make any difference how long the tribulation is. So they have to be here on earth during the tribulation, or there's no point in shortening the tribulation for their sake. Matthew 24 and verse 23, Yeshua says, "For when they say peace and safety, as they might say at the death of the two witnesses, for when they say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them, as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and they shall not escape." So remember, Yahweh's been trying to turn the people back all the way through the 7 trumpets. They haven't turned back through the 7 trumpets. They've killed the 2 witnesses, and now they're saying peace and safety. They're having a big party. They're, having a good time. That's when sudden destruction, the cups, comes upon them, as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman. So this is where we see trumpet number 7 is going to open the cups, and they shall not escape. We can also take a look at what's called the analogy of the pregnant woman. During the seals, which play out over a very long period of time, the woman, Israel, bears an ever-growing burden. Then during the trumpets, which take 7 years, the woman is gripped by labor pains. Then during the thunders, which take place during the time of Jacob's trouble, the woman has the cries of pain, or the thunders. Then during the cups, there's excruciating, even blinding pain, as she gives birth to her child, which is redeemed Israel. So we're going to go from here. As a part of the timeline, trumpet number 7 will open unto the cups. But before we get to the cups, we're going to spend time in 3 inset chapters, chapters 12, 13, and 14. And these are going to give us more information. We're going to cover them in part number 3. Hope to see you there.